Just be happy with who you are. Just be happy with who you are. Just be happy with who you are.
Hi, and welcome to part 2 of chapter 1. In part 2, we are going to review where we are now in our view of abnormal behaviors. Things have been moving more rapidly and much more research-based. As mentioned at the end of part 1 video, we're going to look first at the medical biological model, where the focus is on the role of genetics and the nervous system. Next, we're going to explore the psychological perspective and the theorists and their perspectives to understand the underpinnings of abnormal behavior. We will also touch on the socioculture perspective, then the interactional perspective, where we see some coalescing of theories regarding a popular view of understanding the emergence of abnormal behavior. All right, so let's get started with part 2 and looking at the current perspectives of abnormal behavior. Abnormal behavior may be viewed from various contemporary perspectives, and to summarize, we'll begin with biological perspective, where it incorporates the medical model but refer more broadly to approaches that relate to abnormal behavior, to biological processes, and apply biologically based treatments. Okay? The psychological view, well, we'll begin with the psychodynamic perspective, which reflects on the views of Freud and his followers who believe that abnormal behavior stem from psychological causes involving underlying psychic forces. Learning theorists, they posited that principles of learning can be used to explain both abnormal and normal behavior, where behavior therapy is an outgrowth of the learning model, and humanistic and existential theorists believe that it's important to understand the obstacles that people encounter as they strive towards self-actualization and authenticity. And lastly, into this psychological group is the cognitive theorists, and their focus is on the role of distorted or self-defeating thinking has in explaining what it has in explaining abnormal behavior. The third group will be sociocultural, and their beliefs, they have a belief that abnormal behavior is rooted in social ills such as poverty, societal stress, and institutionalized prejudice and discrimination, not in the individual. They believe that to eliminate abnormality, one must first correct the societal problems that caused it. Some socioculturalists argue that mental illness is a myth created to stigmatize people who do not conform to prevailing social standards. Today, many theorists believe that multiple factors interacting in a complex way are involved in the development of abnormal behavior patterns. The leading interactionist model, the diathis stress model, posits that some people have predisposition, in brackets you could put diathis, for particular disorders, but whether these disorders actually develop depends upon the type and severity of the stressors they experience. So now we're going to look at each one with a little more detail to better understand our foundation of exploring the different categories of psychological disorders. Each perspective will offer us a view of the cause of psychological disorders and treatments. So what you can do is, there isn't an absolute right perspective. You might have an interest in one perspective over another, or you may see how all perspectives can sort of join together and collaborate to form an understanding of psychological disorders. We're going to begin with the biological perspective. There has been a big influence on the biological perspective with the advancements in genetics, epigenetics, and stem cell research. Also, more emphasis of the role of the nervous system. There's been a stronger understanding of biological systems in the patterns of abnormal behavior, in particular at the molecular level and cell communication level. It's gotten quite advance with the use of technology, enabling us to see things that hadn't otherwise been seen. We'll start with genetics. How traits are passed from one generation to the next generation that affect how we look, behave, and function is called heredity, a genetic process. The human genome, all the genetic material encoded in DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, the molecular structure of the genome comprised of 4 genetic compounds, A, T, C, and G. A is adenine, T is thymine, C is cytosine, and G is guanine. There are 2.8 billion pairs, 20 to 25,000 genes, collectively in each individual. Genetic errors can and do occur. This is when a number or sequence of DNA pairs are in some way wrong, and this can lead to bodily structures and functions becoming abnormal or failing. The epigenome is a molecular structure that overlays the genome and play an important part in gene regulation via gene expression. Gene expression is like turning it on. Turn on a gene, or gene silencing, which is turning it off. Epigenetics is providing insights into the origin and the course of many psychological disorders. Now, stem cells you may have heard as being the sort of universal cell. Stem cells, these are what can be divide and develop into a diverse variety of specialized cells, and can be self-renewing to create new and more stem cells. These are just little wonders. So many discoveries are being made that will continue to be made with the growth of epigenetics and stem cells. Now we'll just glance over the nervous system, and the nervous system is made up of nerve cells that are called neurons. They transmit or communicate to each other through their muscle movements, thoughts, writing, through our muscle movements, our thoughts, writings, drawings, creativity, hallucinations, visual or audio. Now let's break down the neuron a little bit. Every neuron has a cell body, and it's known as a soma. The soma contains the nucleus and carries out the metabolic and life-sustaining functions of the neuron. The dendrites project out from the cell bodies and are the primary receivers of signals from other neurons. That's how they communicate. The axon is a tail-like extension of the neuron. It transmits signals to other neurons. At the ends of these axons are the axon terminals. Signals move from the axon terminal to the dendrites, or the cell bodies, of other neurons to muscles, glands, and other parts of the body. The swellings are called knobs. They occupy the tips of the terminals, and each neuron has a soma, dendrites, axon, terminal, and knobs. Neurons communicate to each other by means of chemical substance called neurotransmitters. And there are a variety of neurotransmitters that provide and do different functions. The basics of neurotransmitters: the synapse is the junction point between two neurons, one transmitting, one receiving. Each neurotransmitter has a distinctive chemical structure and will fit in only one receptor site on a receiving neuron. It's like a puzzle piece or a lock and key. Any malfunction or mistake by the neurotransmitter in the brain can be linked to various mental health problems. You might be seeing through this particular model how easy it might be for things to go wrong. You got so many neurons, and a simple little error can make a huge difference. Neurotransmitters are chemicals released into the synaptic cleft from the axon terminal on the sending neuron. There are a variety of neurotransmitters. So what are the functions of some of these major transmitters? Acetylcholine, or ACTH, is involved in learning, movement, and memory. Reduced levels of of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine is associated with Alzheimer's disease. Dopamine affects movement, attention, learning, reinforcement. Excessive levels of the neurotransmitter dopamine appear to be involved in schizophrenia. Norepinephrine and epinephrine help regulate eating, metabolism, and alertness. Excessive and deficiencies of this neurotransmitter have been connected with mood disorders and eating disorders. Glutamate is the brain's primary excitatory transmitter and helps us stay awake, whereas serotonin, another neurotransmitter, is linked to anxiety disorders, mood disorders, sleep disorders, and eating disorders. Endorphins are natural painkillers that contribute to our sense of pleasure and well-being. So just alone in this biological perspective, there's so many complexities that it's not surprising there could be areas that are responsible for abnormal behavior in the medical model. Next, we're going to look at the psychological perspective, starting with the psychodynamic model. Freud developed psychoanalysis as a means of uncovering the unconscious conflicts dating back to childhood that he believed were the root of mental disorders such as hysteria. Freud found that he could treat hysteria by tracing each symptom back to its root cause, often involved in early relationships with parents. Now, Freud's work led him to what he labeled as the structure of the mind. You can consider an iceberg as a model for Freud's structure of the mind. First, the unconscious, the impulsive and repressed primitive urges lie underwater beneath the surface. The preconscious of our outside awareness, but is accessible by focusing our attention, then the conscious, our moment-by-moment awareness. Just as the tip of the iceberg is just a very small part of the whole iceberg, much of what we are aware of, wishes, impulses, fears, urges, sources of our behavior, were beneath our surfaces, hidden in the unconscious mind. Now, Freud also looked at the psychic structures of personality. These may be terms you have heard before. The id is perceived as the source of basal drives and impulses, hunger, thirst, sex, aggression, completely in the unconscious. The id follows the pleasure principle. Instant gratification of instincts, social norms, concern for others are not even considered. It operates by the primary process of thinking. The id relates to the world in fantasy and imagination. Therefore, the id can meet its needs through creating mental images. Imagination in fantasy. You can achieve a lot of this just in your own head. You don't have to actually go out and act on it. The ego is the conscious part of the mind. Now, it is our present awareness and attempts to manage the id's influence, good sense. Therefore, id can get its needs met not by risking social disapproval. Ego is governed by the reality principle. That is, what is practical and possible of the id's impulses and urges. Here it's what's known as the secondary process thinking that takes place. The executive function between the id and the realities of the outside world, it aids in the development of a conscious sense of self. And then lastly is the superego, our moral selves. It is influenced from parenting and initializing through identification. The superego operates under the moral principle at strict adherence to moral standards. The ego fights a continual battle to stay on top of the id and the superego. Occasionally, their conflicts produce anxiety that threatens and overwhelm the ego. The anxiety is a signal that alerts the ego to martial defense mechanisms. The unconscious protective processes that keep the primitive emotions associated with conflict in check, so the ego can continue to coordinate reality functions. Sometimes They're adaptive and helpful, and sometimes they're maladaptive and unhelpful. Now, behavioralism is under the psychological perspective. Behaviorism proposes maladaptive behaviors are learned. Rather than emerging from some underlying cause, medical model or the psychodynamic model. Now, this guy you might be familiar with, Ivan Pavlov. He was the guy that, he's a biologist, and he's the Russian biologist who used the drooling dog and food model. He stumbled upon a form of learning that became known as classical conditioning. I'll go over the main conditions of classical conditioning. First, be aware that a stimulus is something that prompts a response. Prior learning, like taking a test, and the question asks like a prompt, and your precious learning helps. Your previous learning helps discriminate the correct response. Excuse me. So, you'll find this in your textbook, so please review to it. You may find this a little harder to grasp initially. Unconditioned response, that is elicited by the conditioned stimulus without prior learning. Therefore, a salivation to present the presentation of food in Pavlov's dogs, and a startle of a loud noise, the contraction of your pupil in the light or the blink of response are all unconditioned. When it gets, when you stare into the sun, you squint, and that's unconditioned. When someone bangs and makes a huge noise and you have a startled response, that's unconditioned. You didn't learn it. It's an unconditioned response. The presentation of food to Pavlov's dog made them salivate. They didn't have to learn to salivate. So you don't learn those responses. That's what makes it unconditioned response. Now, the unconditioned stimulus, that's what elicits a specific unconditioned or instinctive response without learning. For example, food presented by Pavlov, he didn't teach the dogs to salivate. They did without training. Instinct is what that is about. A loud noise or a bright light in your eye, a puff of air in your eye, these stimuli generally produce an unconditioned response. The unconditioned response of blinking with the puff in your eye, the stimulus is unconditioned too. Now we go to what's known as conditioned stimulus. This is when a previously neutral stimulus that eventually produces the conditioned response after being associated many times with an unconditioned stimulus like a bell to produce salivating, Pavlov's dog. The conditioned response is a learned response to the conditioned stimuli. That occurs after conditioned stimuli is paired with an unconditioned stimulus. Therefore, the conditioned response is the dog salivating to the bell. So, for example, we're in the classroom together and I say the word psychology, neutral stimulus. And I pair that word with a loud noise. I slam the textbook on the table. Bang! That's the conditioned stimulus. It may, for some of you, create the association of the word psychology to a startle effect. That I could say the word psychology and get a startled respect out of some of you. This, for behaviors, can explain phobias, that association. John Watson initiated an experiment to prove fear could be classically conditioned in 1919. Little Elbert is the name of the experiment, or the young lad who was involved, and I'll post that video in the week 1 so you can watch it. Little Elbert was conditioned to be afraid of white rats and other white objects. Once you watch the video, no, this would not be something we could consider ethical research today, but watch the video and see how that gets played out. Another character you might be familiar with in the area of behavior is B.F. Skinner. He introduced what's known as operant conditioning, a type of learning in which the consequence of behaviors are manipulated in order to increase or decrease the frequency of a response and shaping an entirely new response. Therefore, he found that organisms learn new responses or skills when they lead to positive reinforcement. So positive reinforcement, and it'll get kind of fuzzy here because we make some assumptions about terms that we think we know. Positive reinforcement is any pleasant or desirable consequence follows a response and increases the probability that response will be repeated. Now, there are primary reinforcers. These are reinforcers that fulfill basic physical need for survival and does not depend on learning: food, water, sleep. Secondary reinforcers are acquired or learned through association with other reinforcers. Now, secondary reinforcers could include money, praise, applause. Negative reinforcers is not likely as you expect. Negative reinforcement is not punishment. Rather, they increase the frequency of behaviors when they are removed. For example, you've gone to bed, however, there's a dripping faucet keeping you up. You have utilized negative reinforcement by getting up and turning off the tap. So if you take an aspirin to overcome a headache, that's negative reinforcement. Punishment, on the other hand, by definition, is the adverse stimuli that decreases or suppresses the frequency of preceding behavior when they are applied. Unfortunately, too many people misunderstand operant conditioning to effectively influence the learning of others. It's like things like learning and teaching and parenting. Now, still under the psychological perspective, we have Humanistic Model. And the Humanistic Model we're looking at is by Dr. Leslie Greenberg. He's a Canadian out of the York University, is one of the originators of emotion-focused therapy. At the root of Greenberg's approach is emotional intelligence. Essentially, if we handle, experience, and express our emotions in a healthy manner in coping with life, we are healthier and happier. Failing to do so, we risk our health and both physically and emotionally. Lastly, under the psychological perspective, is what's known as cognitive behavioral approach. The focus here is the thoughts and beliefs, expectations, and attitudes that are associated with an underlying abnormal behavior. Essentially, how you think can and does influence our emotional state and our actions. Albert Ellis used what was known as the ABC approach to explaining root causes of people's troubles. A is for the activating events. B is for the beliefs we have that we use to evaluate these events. And C is the consequence, our emotions and behaviors and thoughts as a result. Ellis focused on our emotional beliefs, and in doing so developed REBT, Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, which is an action-oriented psychotherapy that teaches individuals to identify, challenge, and replace their self-defeating thoughts and beliefs with healthier thoughts that promote emotional well-being and goal achievement. Aaron Beck, well, he also looked at cognitive errors for underlying causes. He developed a model of therapy that has become known as cognitive behavior therapy. He proposed helping people identify their faulty ways of thinking. He'd start with 4 cognitive errors and had later developed 7. Now, we are considering his first 4 errors: selective abstraction, overgeneralization, magnification, and absolutist thinking. Now, these were errors in thinking that if you overgeneralization would just be that if you had one bad test, you were a bad student. You've overgeneralized. Instead of looking at it as one discrete test and that the others are not connected or associated, is faulty thinking to think that they are. And that's kind of his perspective. The social cognitive theory by Albert Bandera theorized that learning by observing the behavior of others and the consequences that those people gain through learning vicariously often involved imitation. I don't need to know the stove is hot. I just need to watch you touch the stove to know whether or not it's hot. And that's kind of his perspective. Now, Bandura's term, reciprocal determination, describes how our behavior both acts on and is influenced by our personal and environmental factors. Major influencing factors, expectancies, are personal variable about how we expect or make predictions about outcomes. Cognitive theorists focus on the role of distorted and self-defeating thinking in explaining abnormal behavior. There's another Canadian, Donald Mickelbaum, out of the University of Waterloo, who considers the interdependence of thought, emotion, and actions. Mickelbaum's CBM, Cognitive Behavior Management, focuses on, like other cognitive behavior therapies, on cognitive distortions or errors in thinking. So, as a group, there's a little variety in the psychological perspective. We're going to move now to socioculture, and it's our third group of perspectives. Sociocultural theorists believe that abnormal behavior is rooted in the social ills, such as poverty, societal stress, and institutionalized prejudice and discrimination, not the individual. They believe that to eliminate abnormality, one first must correct the societal problems that cause it. Some sociocultural theorists argue that mental illness is a myth created to stigmatize people who do not conform to prevailing social standards. Now, there's an alternative view, and it's known as drift hypothesis, concerning the relationship between mental illness and social class. Is an argument that illness causes one to have a downward shift in social class. The circumstance of one's social class do not cause the onset of mental disorder, but rather the individual's deteriorating mental health occurs first, resulting in lower societal class attainment. Last but not least is the interactionist perspective. No one theoretical perspective can account for the complex forms of abnormal behavior, is their point. Many theorists today adopt the interactionist perspective. They believe we need to take into account the interaction of multiple factors representing biological, psychological, socioculture, and environmental domains in order to explain abnormal behavior. The leading interactionist model, the diathis stress model, posits that some people have a predisposition, a diathis, for particular disorders, but whether these disorders actually develop depend upon a type of severity of the type and severity of the stressors they experience. Stress can be in the form of biological events, childhood inflictions, physical illnesses, psychological or psychosocial factors, childhood abuses, family contact, negative life events, long-term unemployment, death of a loved one. One of the other interactionist model here that is known here as biopsychosocial systems model. Here, three brand systems are integrated as a means to understand cause and root understanding of abnormal behavior. As the name implies, there are biological domains, psychological domains, and sociological environmental domains to be explored. Now, I know this has been a quick overview. You'll find more explanation in your textbook, but it's to get us on the road to understanding the foundation of abnormal psychology. So this completes our review of Chapter 1. Next week's videos will be exploring Chapter 2. The topics will include assessment, classification, and treatment of abnormal behavior. We will consider how the assessments are made, what classifications can be diagnosed using the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and we'll also consider the methods of treatment based on the major perspectives. I hope you keep your textbook handy as we review the chapters of these videos. Highlight and make notes for yourself, as these will help you during the tests. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next week, everybody.